According to the Bible, the birth of Jesus Christ was not an unexpected moment in history, nor was it a sudden religious development. It was presented as the fulfillment of a long-established divine plan, revealed gradually through many prophets across generations. These prophetic voices spoke in different eras and circumstances, yet their messages aligned around one central truth: a promised Savior would one day be born into the world. This belief forms the foundation of the biblical understanding of Jesus' birth. In the biblical worldview, prophecy is not random prediction. It is divine communication. Prophets were individuals chosen to deliver messages that went beyond their own understanding, revealing God's intention for humanity. When these messages are examined together, a clear pattern emerges. The birth of Jesus was anticipated not by one prophet or one statement, but by many interconnected declarations that built upon one another over time. The earliest promise concerning the coming Savior appears at the very beginning of human history. After humanity's fall, hope was introduced through the promise of a future descendant who would confront evil and bring restoration. This statement laid the groundwork for the idea that redemption would come through a human birth. From that moment onward, the biblical narrative begins pointing toward a child whose arrival would alter the course of history. As time passed, this promise was preserved and refined. The focus shifted to a specific family line, showing that the coming Savior would not appear in isolation, but would be born into human history. God's promise to Abraham established that this child would come through his descendants and that his birth would carry global significance. The blessing associated with this birth was not limited to one people but extended to all nations, indicating a universal mission. This promise continued through subsequent generations, narrowing the lineage and strengthening expectation. Each step revealed more clarity while maintaining continuity. The message was consistent. The Savior would be born as part of a divinely chosen line. Even during periods of hardship, exile, and spiritual decline, the promise remained alive. The birth of the Messiah was portrayed as inevitable, not dependent on human success, but secured by divine purpose. The prophetic narrative later focused on a specific tribe, further refining the expectation. This detail reinforced the idea that the Messiah's birth would be rooted in real people and real history. The child would emerge from among the people, yet his role would extend far beyond ordinary leadership. The prophecy suggested enduring authority and lasting influence, indicating that this birth would mark the arrival of something greater than a temporary ruler. Later revelations connected the promised birth to a royal lineage. The Messiah would be born into a family associated with kingship, but his authority would not mirror earthly power. Instead, his reign would be characterized by righteousness, faithfulness, and divine appointment. This combination of royalty and humility set the Messiah apart from all previous leaders. The expectation of a king born by divine promise became central to the biblical hope. What is striking is the consistency of these prophecies. Different prophets, separated by time and circumstance, spoke in harmony about the coming child. Their messages did not contradict one another. Instead, they added layers of understanding. Each prophet contributed details that complemented the larger picture. This unity suggests intentional design rather than coincidence. As prophetic revelation continued, attention turned to the nature of the Messiah's birth. It was declared that his birth would be extraordinary, marked by divine intervention. This was not to be an ordinary event governed solely by natural processes. Instead, it would serve as a sign, pointing to God's direct involvement. The birth itself would carry meaning, signaling the arrival of God's presence among humanity. This emphasis highlighted the dual nature of the Messiah. He would be truly human, born into the world like others, yet his coming would be initiated by divine power. This balance between humanity and divinity formed a core element of biblical belief. The birth of Jesus was portrayed as the moment when heaven and earth intersected in a unique and transformative way. Another prophetic detail addressed the place of the Messiah's birth. Rather than being born in a center of power or prestige, the chosen location was humble and seemingly insignificant. This choice reflected a recurring biblical theme. God often works through what appears small or overlooked. The birthplace carried historical significance, connecting the Messiah to earlier promises and reinforcing the continuity of the divine plan. The humility of the birthplace underscored the nature of the Messiah's mission. He was not coming to dominate through force or status, but to serve, redeem and restore. His birth in a modest setting reflected the values of the kingdom. He would establish one rooted in compassion, justice and truth rather than external power. The prophets also described the purpose of the coming child. He would be a bringer of peace, a source of hope, and a light to those living in darkness. His birth signaled the beginning of restoration, not only for a single nation but for humanity as a whole. The Messiah was portrayed as one who would heal broken relationships, restore faith, and guide people back to God. These descriptions moved beyond political expectations. They pointed toward spiritual transformation. The Messiah's mission was not limited to changing circumstances, but focused on changing hearts. His birth marked the beginning of a new era in God's relationship with humanity, one defined by grace, reconciliation, and renewal. When all these prophetic elements are considered together, the scope becomes clear. The Bible presents the birth of Jesus as the fulfillment of numerous prophetic voices speaking in unity. Each prophecy contributed to a growing expectation, shaping belief and anticipation across generations. This collective witness forms the basis for the claim that Jesus' birth was foreseen and divinely planned. By the time of his arrival, the prophetic framework was already established. The expectations surrounding the Messiah had been shaped by centuries of revelation. According to the Bible, Jesus' birth aligned with these expectations in a way that affirmed the credibility of the prophetic tradition. This alignment is central to the belief that Jesus is the promised Savior foretold by many prophets. The expectation of the Messiah's birth did not fade with time. Instead, it grew stronger as prophetic voices continued to speak. As generations passed, the message became more detailed, moving from broad promises to specific characteristics. The prophets did not merely announce that a Savior would be born. They described what kind of child he would be and what his presence would mean for the world. These descriptions deepened the understanding of the coming birth and shaped the spiritual imagination of those who awaited him. One of the most profound elements of these prophecies was the emphasis on identity. The coming child was not portrayed as an ordinary human chosen later for a divine task. Instead, he was presented as someone whose significance existed even before his birth. The language used by the prophets suggested preordained purpose and eternal relevance. This child would enter history, yet his role would transcend history itself. His birth was described as the unveiling of something long hidden within the divine plan. The prophets also emphasized the moral and spiritual nature of the Messiah. His birth would mark the arrival of righteousness in a world marked by injustice. Unlike rulers who relied on force or political strategy, this child would lead through truth and faithfulness. His authority would not come from armies or wealth, but from divine approval. This portrayal challenged conventional expectations of leadership and power. As these messages circulated among the people, they created a tension between expectation and mystery. The prophets spoke with confidence about the coming birth, yet many of the details defied human logic. The idea that a single child could carry such global and eternal significance required faith. This tension kept the hope alive while preventing it from becoming purely political or nationalistic. The Messiah was not merely a deliverer from oppression, but a redeemer of the human condition. Another recurring theme was the contrast between appearance and reality. The prophets consistently suggested that the Messiah's birth would not align with worldly expectations of greatness. There was little emphasis on luxury, status, or public recognition. Instead, humility and simplicity were central. This approach revealed something fundamental about the nature of God's work. True power often arrives quietly, and true transformation begins unnoticed. This emphasis on humility reshaped how the promised birth was understood. The Messiah would not be born to impress the powerful or to dominate the proud. His arrival would resonate most deeply with the humble, the faithful, and the searching. This aspect of prophecy highlighted God's concern for those often overlooked by society. The birth of the Messiah was presented as good news for the lowly rather than a threat to the secure. The prophets also spoke about the emotional and spiritual impact of the Messiah's arrival. His birth would bring joy, comfort, and hope to those who had long waited for deliverance. The imagery used often focused on light overcoming darkness and peace replacing fear. These expressions were not abstract ideals, but promises of real change. The Messiah's birth was the beginning of healing for a wounded world. At the same time, the prophets did not ignore the cost associated with this mission. While the birth was celebrated as a moment of hope, it was also connected to suffering and sacrifice. The Messiah's path would not be easy, and his role would involve confronting deep-rooted evil. This connection between birth and suffering added depth to the prophetic message. The Savior would not remain distant from human pain, but would enter into it fully. This dual focus on hope and sacrifice shaped the expectation of the Messiah in a unique way. The birth was not an end in itself, but the starting point of a redemptive journey. The prophets portrayed the Messiah as one who would walk alongside humanity, experiencing its struggles while offering a way toward restoration. This made the promise deeply personal rather than purely theological. Another important aspect of these prophecies was their universal scope. Although the Messiah was connected to a specific people and lineage, his mission was never limited to one group. The language used by the prophets consistently pointed outward, suggesting that the impact of his birth would reach far beyond cultural and geographical boundaries. This universal vision set the Messiah apart from national heroes or reformers. The idea that one birth could influence all nations challenged existing religious boundaries. It suggested a God who was not confined to one place or people, but actively engaged with the entire world. The Messiah's birth symbolized an invitation rather than an exclusion. This inclusive vision contributed to the enduring power of the prophetic message. As time went on, these prophecies were studied, discussed, and preserved. They shaped prayers, songs, and teachings. Families passed them down, and communities gathered around them. The expectation of the Messiah's birth became a shared hope that transcended individual lifetimes. Even when circumstances seemed to contradict the promise, the prophetic words provided reassurance that God's plan was still unfolding. The prophets themselves often lived in difficult times marked by conflict, injustice, and spiritual decline. Yet their messages about the coming birth remained hopeful. This contrast reinforced the belief that the promise did not depend on favorable conditions. The Messiah's birth would occur according to divine timing, not human readiness. This conviction allowed the hope to survive through centuries of uncertainty. Another striking feature of these prophecies is their coherence. Despite being delivered by different individuals in different contexts, they form a unified narrative. Themes of light, peace, righteousness, humility, and restoration appear repeatedly. This repetition strengthened the credibility of the message and helped listeners recognize its divine origin. The prophets were not inventing new ideas, but echoing and expanding upon an established promise. The growing clarity of these prophecies also increased anticipation. As details accumulated, the expectation became more focused. The Messiah was no longer a vague concept, but a coming person whose birth would mark a turning point in history. This anticipation created a spiritual readiness among those who believed, preparing them to recognize the significance of the event when it occurred. The prophets also emphasized that the Messiah's birth would reveal God's character. Through this child, God would demonstrate compassion, faithfulness, and commitment to humanity. The birth was not only about fulfilling promises, but about revealing who God is. It showed a willingness to enter human history and engage directly with human experience. This idea transformed the understanding of divine involvement. God was not distant or detached, but actively present. The Messiah's birth symbolized closeness rather than separation. It suggested that God's response to human brokenness was not abandonment but incarnation, entering the world to restore it from within. As the prophetic tradition developed, the birth of the Messiah became the focal point of hope. It represented the moment when divine promise would become visible reality. The prophets spoke as if this event was certain, even though it lay in the future. Their confidence was rooted not in circumstances, but in trust in God's faithfulness. When these prophecies are considered together, they reveal a carefully constructed expectation. The birth of the Messiah was anticipated as a moment of divine intervention, moral renewal, and spiritual transformation. It was not merely an answer to immediate problems, but a solution to the deeper issue of separation between God and humanity. According to the biblical narrative, this expectation was not misplaced. The birth of Jesus is presented as the moment when these prophetic hopes converged. The qualities described by the prophets, humility, righteousness, compassion, and universal significance, were seen as fulfilled in his arrival. This fulfillment forms the foundation of the claim that Jesus is the promised Messiah. The continuity between prophecy and fulfillment is central to the biblical message. It suggests that history is not random, but guided by purpose. The birth of Jesus is portrayed as a decisive moment within that purpose, bringing centuries of expectation into focus. Through this lens, the prophets are understood, not merely as voices of their own time, but as participants in a larger divine narrative. As the anticipation of the Messiah's birth continued to grow, the prophets began to emphasize the meaning of this event for human identity and destiny. The birth of the promised child was not described as an isolated miracle, but as a turning point that would redefine the relationship between God and humanity. This child would not simply arrive to deliver information or moral instruction. His birth itself would carry transformative power. The prophets spoke of a time when separation, fear, and spiritual blindness would be replaced with closeness, confidence, and understanding. The Messiah's birth was presented as the doorway through which renewal would enter the world. This was not a temporary improvement, but the beginning of a lasting change. Through this child, humanity would be invited into a restored relationship with God, one marked by forgiveness and peace. A recurring theme in these prophecies was accessibility. The Messiah would not be distant or unapproachable. His birth among ordinary people emphasized that divine grace was no longer reserved for a select few. Instead, it was being extended to all who were willing to receive it. This challenged existing religious structures that emphasized separation between the sacred and the everyday. The birth of the Messiah blurred that boundary. The prophets also described how this child would embody both authority and compassion. He would possess the right to rule, yet his leadership would be defined by service rather than domination. This paradox was central to the prophetic vision. The Messiah would be powerful yet gentle, exalted yet approachable. His birth introduced a new model of greatness rooted in humility and love. This vision reshaped expectations about salvation. Rather than being achieved through force or legal compliance, restoration would come through relationship. The Messiah's birth signaled a shift from external regulation to internal transformation. The prophets portrayed this as a renewal of the heart, not merely a reform of behavior. The child would bring change from the inside out. Another significant aspect of these prophecies was the emphasis on truth. The Messiah would be a source of clarity in a world marked by confusion and deception. His birth was associated with light, understanding, and revelation. Through him, hidden realities would be exposed, and false assumptions would be challenged. This role was not limited to religious matters, but extended to the entire human experience. The prophets also addressed the social implications of the Messiah's arrival. His birth would influence how people treated one another. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness were central themes. The Messiah would confront oppression, defend the vulnerable, and restore dignity to those who had been marginalized. This aspect of the prophecy connected spiritual renewal with ethical responsibility. Importantly, the prophets did not portray the Messiah as detached from human suffering. On the contrary, his mission was deeply connected to it. The birth of the Messiah was the beginning of a life that would engage fully with pain, loss, and injustice. This connection made the promise deeply relatable. The Savior would not rescue humanity from a distance, but would walk alongside it. This willingness to share in human experience reinforced the idea that God was intimately involved in human history. The Messiah's birth was a declaration of solidarity with humanity. It signaled that God understood human weakness and was responding with compassion rather than judgment. This message offered hope to those who felt abandoned or unseen. The prophets also suggested that the Messiah's birth would challenge existing power structures. His values would not align neatly with political or religious elites. Instead, his presence would expose hypocrisy and call for genuine transformation. This aspect of prophecy explained why the Messiah's arrival would provoke both devotion and opposition. Light does not only comfort, it also reveals. This tension between acceptance and resistance was built into the prophetic narrative. The Messiah's birth would divide opinion, forcing individuals to respond. Some would recognize the significance of the event and embrace its implications. Others would resist the change it demanded. The prophets presented this as an unavoidable outcome of truth, entering a broken world. Another theme emphasized by the prophets was continuity. The Messiah's birth was not the rejection of what came before, but its fulfillment. The child would honor the promises and principles already revealed while bringing them to completion. This balance between continuity and renewal gave depth to the prophetic vision. It showed respect for the past while pointing toward a transformed future. The prophets also highlighted the enduring nature of the Messiah's impact. His birth would initiate a movement that would not fade with time. The values he embodied would continue to influence lives long after the initial event. This long-term perspective reinforced the idea that the Messiah's significance extended beyond a single generation as people reflected on these prophecies. The birth of the Messiah came to represent hope in its purest form. It symbolized the belief that history was moving toward restoration rather than chaos. Even when circumstances seemed bleak, the promise of the coming child provided reassurance that God's purpose was still active. The prophetic message also encouraged patience and trust. The Messiah's birth would occur according to divine timing, not human expectation. This required faith, especially during periods of silence or disappointment. The prophets themselves often waited without seeing fulfillment, yet they remained confident in the promise they proclaimed. This confidence shaped the spiritual posture of those who believed. The expectation of the Messiah's birth fostered watchfulness, humility, and readiness. People were encouraged to live in a way that aligned with the coming reality, preparing their hearts for the transformation the Messiah would bring. The prophets further suggested that the birth of the Messiah would redefine victory. Success would no longer be measured by conquest or dominance, but by reconciliation and peace. This redefinition challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about power and achievement. The Messiah's birth introduced a different way of understanding greatness. This new understanding had profound implications for personal identity. Individuals were invited to see themselves not merely as subjects or followers, but as participants in a renewed relationship with God. The Messiah's birth opened the door to belonging and purpose. It affirmed that every person had value within the divine plan. As the prophetic tradition matured, the anticipation surrounding the Messiah's birth became increasingly rich and multidimensional. It was no longer simply about waiting for an event, but about embracing a vision of restored humanity. The prophets painted a picture of a world transformed by the arrival of a child whose life would reflect God's heart. When viewed as a whole, these prophecies reveal a deep coherence. They speak of a Messiah whose birth would initiate a comprehensive renewal, spiritual moral, relational, and social. This holistic vision sets the biblical expectation apart from purely political or philosophical hopes. According to the biblical narrative, the birth of Jesus is presented as the moment when this vision began to take shape in reality. The themes articulated by the prophets found expression in his arrival, confirming